much for joining us both in person and online. I think we've got quite a few people watching. I'm afraid those who are watching remotely won't be able to ask questions, but those of you who have been able to brace the weather and come in today will be able to. And joining us here today are fabulous panel. So I'll start with Rachel. Rachel is the founding partner at Public First, which is a policy a policy that does a lot of polling and comes up with policy ideas. Rachel also co-authored the Conservative Party's 2019 election manifesto, and she is, of course, the co-host of Tortoise's Trendy podcast alongside John Curtis. Then we have Tom Brake, who is a former Lib Dem MP and the director of Unlock Democracy. He was an MP for 22 years we're going to get on to the 2019 election and what that sort of did shortly. And Naomi Smith is the Chief Executive of Best for Britain and founder of Trade Unlocked. So thank you very much, all three of you, for coming in this evening. As you know, the subject of today's discussion is the voters' chessboard, whose vote counts. And I wanted to start by asking our panellists for an anecdote. I initially thought an anecdote of the 2019 election, but Rachel has a very good one from 2017. So I'm going to make it a free-for-all, and any election anecdote is yours.
Do you want me to start?
Please.
2019, actually, from internally in the Conservative Party was a very tame process. Only one member of the cabinet leaked, and it was exactly the member of the cabinet we thought was going to leak. So there was no real harm done. It was all very professional, and and people were actually deliberately, as Labour is now, trying to downplay internally what the victory might be, which is rather different from 2017, where I was saying I was asked to stand against Tom. And I declined, thankfully, because I was 7 months pregnant at the time. But I did stand in a safe Labour seat. And I vividly remember relatively early in the 2017 campaign, one of the regional coordinators explaining to all of us candidates that if Theresa May stood for every single seat in the land, she would win every single seat. And it was Theresa May's Conservative Party that was going to bring us to victory. And you always know when someone says that, when it's the leader, that you're in a little bit of trouble. But 2019 was relatively trouble-free for us, at least.
Okay, and Tom, what's your anecdote?
Yeah, so Kat asked me for the anecdote from 2019, and my immediate response was, I lost. But that's not what she had in mind. I think it was not particularly exciting
I did say
anecdote.
a not painful anecdote.
But, so I thought of another, which was some years after getting elected, I turned up, as I was wont to do, on my bicycle. I'd arranged to meet a constituent in his house. I arrived. I assumed he knew who I was. Rather strangely, he obviously didn't, because he let me into his house and I sat down. And after 15 minutes, he looked at his watch and said, "Where's the MP?" I guess the anecdote is, if you're a member of Parliament, you need people to know that you cycle. Otherwise, they'll assume that you're a random bloke on a bicycle.
I don't believe the hype. And Naomi?
Well, 2019 general election, I tried to stop quite hard. So I was really worried about it. And in the summer of 2019, at Best for Britain, we did a big poll where you can get a seat level projection. It's called MRP. I'm sure we can come on to that, although if you listen to Trendy, you'll know all about different polling techniques. And we were predicting an 81 seat majority for the Conservatives in the August. And so I used that to go to the Lib Dems and go to Labour and go to the SNP and go to Plaid and Greens and say, look, don't do it. Don't do it. Box Johnson in. We can probably get Corbyn over the line on a second referendum if we just keep Johnson there. Don't give him a rip-roaring majority. I think it is testament to my lack of influence that, of course, we then did get an election where he got an 80-seat majority.
Impressive forecast.
Yes, and you have an equally bold forecast for 2024. I went to your press conference, press launch last year.
Yeah.
Remind me, is it a 200 seat majority?
Well, I mean, polling is a snapshot in time. So it's like a balance sheet. All it's telling you is, had there been an election on the day that the public were asked a particular question, what would the outcome have been? We've done a much more recent poll that we published in the Sunday Times on New Year's Eve, 8-9 days ago. And rather than asking the Westminster voting intention question and getting the kind of seat projection from that, we asked people who would make the best Prime Minister. And Starmer is winning in a lot of constituencies. Don't Know is the second most popular choice. And dear old Rishi Sunak only leads in 4 constituencies, not even in his own, in Richmond and North Yorkshire, where he came third behind Don't Know and Starmer.
So what are the 4 that I can hope to cling on to?
Mid Bedfordshire, I've probably got them written down somewhere. Clacton, Mid Bedfordshire, they're all those East Coasty ones. They're all together. I'll find it on my.
It's interesting that Mid Bedfordshire is one because, of course, they've just lost that seat.
Or maybe it's North Bedfordshire.
Right.
One of the Bedfordshires. I'll come back to you.
All right.
I'll have it
Hold
somewhere.
that thought. Okay, so to the sort of broad theme of what we're talking about today, the sort of whose vote counts. My first question, I suppose, is, are all votes equal? So I was just talking to Jasper, one of my colleagues there, and he says he's never been in a constituency that where his vote has mattered. And I think a lot of people feel like that. So are all votes made equal, or are some votes more equal than others? Tom, do you want to start?
Well, can I guess as a former politician, you'd expect me to answer a different question. And that is, which votes don't count? And we know that there are 8 million people who are not on the electoral register who are eligible to vote. So their votes won't be counting. We also know that in the May council elections, there were 14,000 people turned away from polling stations because they didn't have photographic voter ID. An extrapolation would suggest there's going to be something of the order of 100,000 people in the general election who are going to be turned away. So their votes don't count. And we saw in the papers about 10 days ago, I think, Labour announced that they were selecting in, I think, 211 non-battlefield constituencies. So, frankly, there's not going to be much action in those 211 seats. And equally, I assume, Rachel may know better, that there'll be 200 seats in which the Conservatives will be treating as non-battlefield seats. And therefore, frankly, for the voters in those seats, the political parties aren't going to be very interested in them. So I've answered the reverse of your question, but I hope that gives a bit of sort of grist to the mill for others to respond to.
Sure.
Well, I am amazed you didn't talk about PR, because that was what I was expecting you to talk about: proportional representation and the voting system, and the lack of democratic equality from that. So, a lot of votes don't count. Most votes don't get counted for the reasons your colleague probably was suggesting. If you live in a safe seat and you don't vote for the party who is safe, it's highly unlikely your vote is going to make much of a difference, which is unlike most liberal democracies around the world. I think in Europe, it's only Belarus and the UK at a national election that use a first past the post system. So, if all you need to win, if you get 10,000 votes and your opponent gets 10,001 votes, they win, even though almost as many people do not want that person as their first choice. So, to my mind, we don't have democratic equality at the moment in the UK, and in fact, it's rolled back because the Elections Act that was passed a couple of years ago is taking any proportionate systems that we had for instance, metro mayoral elections. Some of the more proportionate systems that we had for some of our elections are now being reverted back to a first past the post system. So for those of you who are Londoners, when Sadiq Khan goes for re-election this time, he will be doing so under a different system to the one that he was elected on previously. It will be a first past the post race this time.
So thinking about it more from a sort of geographical sort of perspective, how marginal in 2024 does a seat have to be for it to be a truly marginal seat? I mean, presumably, given the state of the polls, we are talking about much bigger majorities being up for switching than previously.
Yes, and also we have an inherently more volatile electorate than we used to. So you would, I think it's reasonable to assume that switching is going to happen more often for quite a long time. Because we don't have nearly a strong allegiance to specific political parties. The Eastern political parties are weaker than they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And because across Europe and the States, you're seeing very wild swings. I mean, one of the consequences of us not having a PR system is you're actually getting fewer wild swings in our political system than you're seeing in the Netherlands or elsewhere. Under a PR system, Nigel Farage would have lots of representation in the Commons and would seek to gain more. So I think we have an inherently relatively volatile electorate. And if the polls stay as they are today, a huge proportion of seats are up for grabs. Tom may have a different view, but I think it's fairly clear that in terms of the strategy of Labour and the Conservatives, it's to look at the switchers from Conservative votes in 2019 who've mostly gone to don't know, quite a bit to Reform, some to Labour, not a huge amount. It's getting those that is the priority, which is why you're seeing a lot of risk aversion on the Labour side in terms of looking insufficiently socially conservative. I think too much on fiscal conservatism, we can come back to that, and a lot of attention on the Conservative side on issues that they think divide that group. That's where they're really focused. And I mean, the red wall is an exaggeration, and normally when you do polls, you don't get a terribly different result from the red wall than you do anywhere else. But people often think about those as in the north and in the Midlands.
Yeah.
If I was a Conservative Member of Parliament and I had a majority of less than 10,000, according to the polls, I should be worried.
Yes.
Because it does feel, again, like 1997. I think I took my seat and overturned a 10,000 vote majority, and that was happening pretty much across the country to sitting Conservative members of Parliament. I think the added factor that we may have this time is if Reform do put up candidates against the majority or indeed all of the Conservative candidates, then there will be that in a lot of marginal seats, that will make the difference. So in 2017, in my seat, the predecessor to Reform, the Brexit Party, I think it was at that point, didn't put up a candidate. I won. 2019, they didn't put up a candidate and I lost. And because those votes went to the Conservative and my seat was very marginal. So if Reform stand, then in a seat like the one that I used to hold, where the Conservative majority is 629 votes in Carshot Wallington, in the seat close by Wimbledon, where the majority is 628, if Reform stand, then that's almost a guarantee that the Conservatives will be losing that seat.
I think
those two seats.
One of the factors, sorry, Naomi, that I should have mentioned I didn't, that's quite a big unknown, is how much tactical voting makes a difference in individual seats, because most polls and MRPs don't really pick that up. And the evidence we have so far from local elections and other by-elections is tactical voting could be a very big deal. So if it's anyone but the Tories, there are very few marginal seats available.
Do you think that is a stronger message now than it has been in sort of recent memory? Is the sort of, 13, now 14 years of Tory government as an attack line, you picking that up in focus groups and people kind of repeating it back to you voluntarily?
I think all the evidence, Naomi, sorry, I apologise. All the evidence, I think, is that the shift in polling is a negative effect, not a positive effect.
Yeah.
People are done with the current Conservatives. They're not particularly enthused about any alternative. That's one of the reasons you're getting so many don't knows, not clear how much turnout is going to be. And that drives tactical voting. I would like whoever is going to get these people out.
On the marginality point, the other thing that we've got this time round is boundary changes. So lots of constituencies have changed their formation. So an MP may have had a majority of however many at the last election. It's going to have to be an inferred majority that's up for defence this time round, because they may be taking in several wards from a neighbouring constituency that tend to vote differently or whatever. So a lot of MPs are going to feel jittery and marginal, even if perhaps they're not. And look, all candidates, whether they are seasoned, 22 years in Parliament MPs, or brand new, get candidatitis at the last minute and panic and think they're going to win. So they're all going to say, I'm marginal, you've got to come and help me. HQ of my party, you must send more resource. So there's that factor. On the tactical voting point, you're completely right. There are very few pull factors towards Labour, but there are very, very strong push factors away from the Conservatives that we're picking up in our constituency level polling in England and in Wales to an extent. And that's showing up in these very bloated don't know figures at the moment. Now, when we've drilled down into those and asked them lots and lots of follow-up questions to try and identify who they are, they look very close to the profile of a current Conservative voter. We sort of map about 75% over to the current Conservative voter. So it's whether they will be motivated to turn out and for whom that is the big issue. In Scotland, also we're seeing some quite chunky don't knows, and they seem to be not shy Conservatives who are just not wanting to say that they're Tories and answering a poll, but homeless Nats. So they're sort of upset that the Sturgeon issue happened. They're not so enthused by the current leadership there, and yet they haven't yet been totally drawn over to Labour, and they're sort of floating around, feeling very pro-European, feeling very angry with Brexit, and not quite sure where they're going to go. And Anna Sarwar, the leader of Labour in Scotland, doing quite a bit to try and convince them that he is the right choice. So that's all very interesting, and tactical voting, I think, is going to play a huge role. In previous elections, tactical voting has largely focused on the progressive left parties, because under a first past the post system, you've got those votes hemorrhaged across 3-4 parties, where on the right you tend to have them consolidating behind one or two. This time round, I think there are going to be plenty of Conservative voters who are done, they want change, and they're not sure how they ought to be voting in their constituency to protest and to signal that change with any real effect. So that's why tactical vote sites like Best for Britain's one and others will try and give them guidance on how they should cast their vote to get that change.
But I think just on the tactical voting front, I think another factor that is really has great influence is what activity there is on the ground, because people will be seeing action from one or other of the parties that's opposing the Conservatives. And if it's very clear that one or other of those parties, whether it's the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Greens, are being active and no one else is being active in that constituency, then the voters will draw the logical conclusion that that's the party to vote for if I want to oppose the Conservatives.
Back to your point about the Brexit Party and what Farage and Tice will do in terms of standing down candidates. One of the reasons we got that accurate 81-seat majority in 2019 is because we modelled the effect of Brexit Party standing down in the Conservatives' most marginal seats, because UKIP had done something quite similar in 2017 as well. And I was like, okay, if they do that again, then. When people ask me, is there any hope for the Conservatives? Look at these major leads for Labour at the moment. Can they claw this back at all? My answer is it's the only chance they've got of getting back towards some kind of hung parliament territory, if not even potential minority Conservative government situation, is rather than Labour landslide, that is if Reform stand down in their marginal seats.
But I wonder whether they have any incentive to do it this time. And the incentive last time was that Boris Johnson could win, and obviously did go on to do so.
They're not standing in Wellingborough by-election. They've announced that they're not putting up a candidate there against Peter Bone's
girlfriend.
girlfriend, yeah, who's now the candidate. Yeah.
So we've talked a bit about the sort of demographics, but if we could just try and drill down to the specifics. Obviously, it seems to me as though towns are going to be the kind of focal point as opposed to cities and perhaps sort of more rural areas. The sort of name that has been the archetype, the Stevenage woman voter, has been the one that's sort of been bandied around. Do you think that is a sort of a likely candidate, given the sort of majorities that we're talking? I think Frank Luntz, the US pollsters, told Conservative MPs if they're on less than 15,000, they should be worried. The Stevenage majority is 8,562, so that's almost half that amount. Presumably, that's very achievable for a Labour. I mean, it is Labour Together that came up with this archetype, so they must think it is.
I feel I interrupted you last time, so you should go first this time.
I've got my own. She's not Stevenage woman. She's Tactical Tina. Because when we did our big poll that went into the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago, we found that when we asked people, are you prepared to vote tactically to change the government? Are you prepared to vote tactically to keep the government? When we looked at the ones that said that they were prepared to vote tactically to change the government, and they were showing up as don't know in terms of how they would vote to get that outcome, they were 69% of them were women, 43% of them were university educated, 81% of working age. They were very split on their Leave Remain vote back in 2016. They were very evenly split between Labour and the Conservatives in terms of how they voted in 2019. 90% of them say that Brexit has worsened the cost of their weekly shop. And therefore 55% of them wanted Starmer to negotiate a closer relationship with Europe if he wins. So the profile of voter who I think is really going to matter are these women in working age. Actually, they're mostly in kind of administrative and low-level managerial jobs. I don't know if they live in towns or not, but there will be lots of them in towns because we model that there's probably about 1 million of these voters across the country, and of course you would only need a few hundred in any one constituency to change things if they vote tactically in a way that helps, obviously.
And it's interesting that your archetype is also a woman.
Yeah.
So we think, because obviously last time it was Workington man and we're familiar with Mondeo man, but this time it's in the hands of the women. So do you think then, again, that there are, I think, crossovers with Stevenage women in terms of this sort of apathy towards politics, of feeling that having voted before, nothing has changed, nothing has improved. We've seen some of that in the speeches that Starmer has been giving, both his one last week and party conference. Surely there's a problem that Stevenage woman or Tactical Tina just doesn't vote at all. The don't knows continue to be don't knows.
Yeah, I think if I were Starmer, who is doing just fine, by the way, so I will caveat this. I think there are two things I would be worried about. I would be a bit worried about turnout. And I would be very worried about how fast my ratings are going to tank after an election. Because we have a relatively unusual situation, in fact, very unusual situation in having a party that's very ahead and a leader that is in negative territory, not as negative as he was, but that doesn't normally happen. And as an example of a polling question that we asked relatively recently, when people asked whether they thought the country would get better under Rishi Sunak, under Keir Starmer, or neither, it was actually split fairly evenly between them, much more evenly than you'd expect. And generally, very high percentage of people think that there is going to be no change. The thing you hear sort of again and again in focus groups is it doesn't matter. It's not going to get any better. Nothing is going to change. So you have both high dissatisfaction and high apathy in a different political system. I mean, this would be incredibly ripe for a new party. I still think it's relatively ripe for one, but I'm really ripe, I think, as much as I've seen in my political career. So I think that is the big worry. And of course, the decision that Labour have taken for perfectly good reasons, which is to shut down any risk also means they don't really have any dividing lines, except for the perfectly reasonable, we're not them. But then it is quite difficult, or more difficult, to say this is why it's going to be better than us, and somewhat more difficult when you turn up after the election to say, surprise, here's our secret plan, we never told you, or not do anything. So I think, I don't want to overdo this. They're doing just fine, but it's not an ideal situation for them.
And you made the point, which I didn't pick up on earlier, about them not being economically or not appealing economically to red wall voters sufficient. You think they need to be bigger spending?
Yeah, so one of the things that really interests me is how terrified Labour is about appearing to be the big spenders. And there's a historic thing, sort of millstone around their neck, this sort of belief that if you're a party on the left that doesn't look like they are financially responsible, then they are doomed to failure. That said, I would say two things. The first is, the centre of gravity of the country broadly is somewhat left economically and really quite right-wing on social issues, right? That's where they've been forever, is where they are now. So there are plenty of left-wing economic things on taxation and things that you could announce that would be very popular and popular to your don't know kind of Con-19 people. The second is, this needs sort of more kind of teasing out over time, but one thing that we have really picked up since COVID and since the energy crisis is that people believe far more than they used to, well, of course the government can find the money. The kind of core fiscal conservatism that was such a big part of belief post-financial crisis and before, and which may return, it seems much weaker to me now. So there are some areas of their caution that I'm not convinced are so necessary.
Could I just come in on going back briefly to the question of Stevenage woman or disillusioned suburban is the other sort of categorisation. Your very first question was whose vote counts? Labour have identified Stevenage woman as a group that is critical to their political success. So if you are Stevenage woman, who incidentally might also be a man and of course they don't all live in Stevenage, then your views are of particular interest to the Labour Party because they see that as a core group. The sort of patriotic group, who were perhaps the red wall voters, seem to have reverted to Labour, so Labour don't necessarily need to say things that will appeal to them, but they certainly need to say things that appeal to disillusioned suburbans or Stevenage woman. Just on the question of tax, as I understand it, the public are much more supportive of, for instance, tax increases at a point where they're feeling wealthy. And so at the moment, when nobody is feeling particularly wealthy, I think any political party that's talking about tax increases, which would be necessary to spend, unless they're going to push up the debt, which is also already at very significant levels, I think that probably explains some of the caution that Labour have in terms of pushing an agenda which might require taxes to enable spending on public services, for instance.
But do you think the question is, I suppose, which is more damaging, to be seen to row back from the 28 billion green pledge entirely, or they're talking about dropping the 28 billion number, having already sort of watered it down, or as Rachel says, maybe some people might be a bit more amenable to it if they thought that services were being invested in.
Well, I think the calculation is probably that Labour think that they can win by saying and doing nothing, and therefore that reducing any possible targets to present the smallest target possible, so getting rid of the £28 billion pledge or scaling it back is what I assume that they may be planning on doing. It negates perhaps the one line of attack that the Conservatives might have against them.
Yes. And before we move on, you say about the Stevenage women being the Labour archetype. Is there a Lib Dem archetype that they are looking for?
I don't know is the honest answer to that question, but clearly the seats where the Liberal Democrats are in the strongest contention are pretty much all Conservative facing. There'll be home counties, a bit in the southwest, a bit in South London, southwest London. Mm-hmm. So probably appealing to people with university education who are interested in climate change issues, worried about clamping down on protests, perhaps that sort of. And I don't think Stevenage Woman falls into that particular niche in terms of the description that's given.
But we have talked quite a bit about the red wall, and I know these are very sort of crude descriptions, but the blue wall, obviously there is an awful lot of Conservative seats that the majorities are paper thin after 2019 because Conservative voters in those parts of the world didn't like Boris hugely and didn't like Brexit at all. And so, but were scared of Corbyn. Three big issues that are not going to be play this time round. And so I suppose the question is, will now that the sort of fear factor of Corbyn has gone, will some people sort of stick with the Conservatives where they wouldn't have done previously, or because they are so disillusioned with the Conservative government, will they follow sort of everyone else out the door?
Well, I think the results of some of the by-elections point to the fact that people will be willing to switch. But I mean, I'm not an official Lib Dem spokesman in any shape or form, but I assume that the experience of 2019, where the party went too far and wide in terms of its targeting, with not much success, points to a much more focused strategy, 30, 40 seats, running pretty strongly on local issues is what the campaign will be about, is my guess.
Naomi,
it is incredibly difficult to replicate by-elections across 638 constituencies across GB, or however many it is. And this is why tactical voting at a general election is much harder for voters to get their heads around than in a by-election, particularly most of the by-elections that we've had in the last couple of years, where Labour and the Lib Dems have made some kind of unofficial nod, wink, wink, that one's yours, this one's mine. Uxbridge being an exception to that, and look how it ended. But it's really obvious. You don't need to be given tactical voting advice. The Political Studies Association did a brilliant paper, I think in early 2021, that showed the vast majority of voters in England could not correctly name which party was in second place in their constituency. I've tested this with journalists in the lobby. Some of your colleagues, Kat, I say, where do you live? And they tell me, and I'm like, do you know who your MP is? They may know the answer. They definitely know which party. And then I say, who came second at the last election? And most of them haven't got a clue. Now, if someone who is steeped in Westminster politics doesn't know that, what chance is the ordinary person who has just not got the time nor inclination to think about it going to do in terms of tactical voting? It may just be as simply binary as, oh, well, if it's not the Conservatives, I'll vote Labour. Now, if you live in certain blue wall constituencies, take Dominic Raab's seat of Esher and Walton, were you to be a small business owner that's always voted Conservative, who lives in that seat, and you're fed up with the interest repayments on your business loans, not being able to get enough staff in the warehouse, you're like, I'm done, I need change. Right, I'll vote for Labour. Of course, in a seat like Esher and Walton, that is, en masse, that would allow the Conservatives to hold that seat.
But that's why in Esher and Walton, for instance, the ground campaign is so important, that a resident or a constituent in that constituency in the last 4 weeks of the campaign are likely to struggle to push open their door because of the number of Liberal Democrat leaflets that are behind it. So they will get the message in terms of volume.
And it's interesting you say that about by-elections, and obviously we know it's a truism, by-elections are very different from general elections, but there are at least 3 happening in the next few weeks, and I guess the question is, to what extent do you think they might give us a sense of what's going to happen? Rachel, you don't think so?
I think the results of by-elections are usually pretty irrelevant, except that they scare MPs. So the effect of a by-election is really on what it does to the already pretty frayed loyalty within your party, and how much again, if I were the Conservatives, leaving aside everything else, one of the things I would be worried about is that in the middle of my election campaign, many of my colleagues are going to be making sure they're positioning themselves for the leadership afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be worried about losing their seats. And so that's the impact that by-elections have, and lots of media coverage. But in terms of actually
and the reason for some of these by-elections being triggered as well, do you think that's going to have a bearing at all? I mean, it's sleaze and standards and net zero, rebellion on principle.
I think the last will have the least, actually. I think that lots of Conservative MPs will definitely be worried about the just general aura around the party, and about being how they're associated with that and what that means for their future. But no, I don't. I mean, and it is definitely true that not any specific event, but the accumulation of 100 different events has permeated it somewhat into the public mind in terms of who these people are and what the government is. But I don't think actual by-elections change very much. I think we spend insane amounts of attention on them, given their actual relevance.
I think one impact that they do have, however, is that if Rishi Sunak, in the last couple of months before Christmas, was thinking about, I'm going to be relaunching myself, or I'm going to be launching my election campaign in January for something that might happen in May or might happen in November, whatever was in the grid for the first month is now, or possibly slightly longer than that, is now pretty much derailed, because there's a series of by-elections where they're going to have to firefight whatever the results of those by-elections are. So it makes the comms effort much harder.
And then you have that leading into the local elections, which we're expecting to be quite bad for the Conservatives as well. So there is this kind of ongoing drip feed of sort of negative headlines, in the sense that they can't win, which becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we've kind of touched on a bit on reform. And obviously the role they played in 2019 was perhaps not the role that we expected them to play, because they stood people down. We don't know, I guess, whether they are likely to do that again. But if they don't, you think that they will have a significant, albeit unrepresentative role, I guess. They're not going to necessarily, it's not expected they will get any MPs, but they will still have an opportunity to shave off a significant amount of vote share, do you think, Naomi?
Well, I mean, I would argue that Nigel Farage has huge influence without any MPs, and has acted as a drag on the Conservative Party for a very long time. I mean, you only need to go back to the early days of Cameron's premiership to see the real effects of that, and him beginning to think, oh God, there's this right flank that can be courted now by this other character. I've long argued that Farage copies what happened in Canada in the 80s, where a charismatic chap rather like him was sufficiently disaffected with the nationally largest Conservative Party, left, set up his own party called the Reform Party. It became very, very successful, acted as a sort of huge drag on the pre-existing Conservative Party, and it ends up in a merger, and he gets to take his place back in his former home. I think that is what Farage would like to do. I think he would like the Conservative Party to be something he felt he could rejoin. So I think he has huge influence, regardless of whether or not he actually stands candidates, by sort of acting as this threat to them all the time under this first past the post system. And it's worth bearing in mind, he's the sole owner of the Reform Party. When you look on Companies House, it's a limited company. It has one director, one person of significant control, and that is Nigel Farage. Richard Tice doesn't actually have any real power. So Richard Tice can be out and about saying we're standing everywhere, we're standing everywhere. It's not actually up to him.
And I mean, their most recent press conference, they talked about Labour. They've got this attack ad, Starmageddon. How serious a prospect do you think it is that they will actually be going up against Labour? Or is that just a cover for what they will be doing to the Conservatives? I mean, are they really likely to take much of a vote share from Labour?
Well, I think principally it would be from the Conservatives. I think that's pretty clear. I referred to those 2 seats earlier, majorities of under 1,000 for sitting Conservative members of Parliament, in this case up against Lib Dems as the main contenders. In my old seat, typically UKIP used to poll 1,500 votes, so which will come pretty strong, or came pretty strongly from the Conservative Party. Some of them, yes, from Labour, some from Lib Dem, but principally from the Conservative Party. So standing Reform candidates is going to suck votes away from the Conservatives. And the more marginal the seat is, the bigger impact that will have. But of course, also, I suppose the other thing that Reform will undoubtedly try to do is try to shift the government's agenda on things like stop the boats and immigration, asylum. And if they succeed in doing that, then they potentially exacerbate the tensions within the Conservative Party over the One Nation group, who are not particularly vocal at rebelling against some of the things that they say they're not very happy with, but might be more so if the Reform Party succeed in dragging the Conservative Party even more onto their terrain than is currently the case.
Rachel, that is another point, isn't it? We've talked a lot about sort of types, but we've not really talked much about policy and any kind of real substantive changes that can be made in Westminster, whether that might change the mood out in the rest of the country. If the Rwanda policy goes through, and if, although it seems unlikely, a flight does take off, do you think that will change the calculation for voters in the parts of the country where the Conservatives are desperately trying to reach?
I guess the first thing to say is that we talk a lot about voter archetypes and voter splits. There's actually remarkable consistency in what voters are worried about on the kind of very top issues, and they are the cost of living in the NHS. Mm-hmm. And the reason that Sunak tried to do the 5 pledges a year ago, I'm losing track, was because some very nice pollster will have said, these are the things that everyone's worried about. And so can you say you'll fix them? And he said, okay, I'll say I'll fix them. And that became the 5 pledges, even though there actually wasn't an enormous amount he could do on the first 2 to fix them in this period. So the reason that they've ended up with migration, particularly illegal migration, is because it is a very big concern for a subset of voters, and it has gone up massively. There was a YouGov tracker quite recently which showed really remarkable increases from all Conservative 2019 voters.
Because it had fallen, hadn't it?
It had fallen a lot, and it's really gone up. And their tracker merges legal and illegal migration, so and you do need to treat them slightly differently. But it has gone up enormously. And because they think it is one of the few things where they can demonstrate some change, and one of the few areas where they actually have a big dividing line. Because the other problem, there isn't much difference between Conservative and Labour policy on the economy, on the cost of living, or on the NHS. It's not obvious what the big differences are. They're not going to spend particularly differently. I think the problem they have is that voters are bored of announcements. They don't believe anything any politician says. They want to see real results, and it's not obvious to me a flight to Rwanda is a real result. The Conservatives are possibly, sensibly, politically, unwilling to go the full hog and say, well, we'll change all the laws. So I think it's quite hard to see how whatever happens wouldn't be vulnerable to Nigel Farage saying this is a joke. Mm-hmm. But they are hoping a combination of that and vastly improved economic indicators later this year make a difference. And that Labour will be forced to tear itself apart at some point on what are tensions within itself around migration, legal and illegal, because they do have a much more split coalition on that.
They do, but they also have a much tighter grip on discipline
right now. Absolutely, and I think that will almost certainly continue. But what levers do the Conservatives have? They have to hope they can break open those divisions, and they will try.
Okay, I just want to turn it over to the audience, see whether there are any questions. Jasper, you've got the mic. Oh, thank you. Yeah, please, Sue. Yeah, you can introduce yourself and then ask a question.
My name's Mike. clearly the big picture is reaction against the Tories, but there are a couple of areas where there is a sense that Labour are the current incumbents, which are Wales and London. And you hear a lot of Welsh people saying, oh, the health service is a mess and we hate driving at 20 miles an hour. We're going to vote against Labour. And in London, of course, you had the whole ULEZ thing. So what will the kind of reacting against a Labour perceived incumbency, will that make a big difference?
Yeah, I mean, there are some people, a minority, I would say, who think that, you know, it's not impossible that we may have a Conservative mayor and a Labour government. Do you think that's likely at all?
Well, of course, the voting system has been changed in London to gerrymandered, I would argue, to try to facilitate the election of a Conservative mayor in London. And it will leave Liberal Democrat, Green and supporters of other parties with a dilemma now that we have a first past the post system to elect the mayor in London. Do you vote for Sadiq Khan as your best guarantee of stopping the Conservative getting elected, who frankly many of her views I find slightly unpalatable, or do you stick with your party knowing the risk associated with it? So in London, I think there is that possibility, and I think that's as I said, that's because the system, I'm afraid, has been gerrymandered in a way that changes to elections are supposed to be something that are done by agreement, not by diktat, and that hasn't happened in this case.
Local issues do play a massive part in elections, and I think where you have a Labour-run council that maybe isn't performing so well and people are particularly frustrated, or, for instance, take Brighton, where Labour have just taken control of the council from the Greens because it was felt by a lot of local residents that the Greens were not running Brighton as well. But of course, Caroline Lucas is the MP. She's not really standing. Sian Berry, the candidate selected there, whether people will feel that, okay, well, look, you know, now Labour are running the council, I can live with, or I'm very happy for our national representative to be Green or not. I mean, take Wales, you mentioned. Today I saw a headline that I didn't have on my 2024 bingo card, which is that a Labour-run council is hoping to lobby the Welsh and Westminster governments to make the Severn Bridge a toll road again, which is effectively putting a trade barrier between England and Wales were you to do that. And the very strongly in favour of Brexit Conservative MP is saying, no, we need freedom of movement between these two places. So, you know, local issues do play a significant impact. But from our focus groups and polling, the sentiment across the country is so predominantly, it is time for change now. We are just fed up. Anything but this will do. That I suspect that will, I mean, it will depend how people campaign locally and say, well, look, the Labour council is terrible, therefore don't vote for them in the Westminster election. But I can't feel it having a huge impact.
And I would echo that. I think anecdotally, and it's based on anecdote of one election, some elections ago, probably before the 2010 general election, I think, my local authority had decided to change the refuse collection system from a weekly to a fortnightly. And there were reports from all over the place that it was all chaos, pictures online of people's bins overflowing, etc. And I thought, that's it. Because the local authority was Lib Dem. I thought, that's it, I'm finished. But actually, in terms of the general election result, it didn't make any difference at all that I could detect. So I'm not sure that actually, when you've got all the coverage of a general election, you've got all the material that's going out around a general election, that local factors can have that bigger an impact. And in relation to the ULEZ by-election, obviously that was a by-election where the Conservatives had identified rightly that as being a significant campaign issue. They could pile all their resources into it. They're not going to be doing that across 80 seats in London come the general election. So that local effect gets diluted, I think.
So for the mayoral, they will almost certainly double down on it.
They will. Have they got the capacity to do that across London? Probably not.
I think it's a really good question. That it's obviously right that people being cross with the Labour Mayor of London isn't going to make them vote Tory in the general election. But I also think there's an interesting question about why you don't get more anti-sentiment on some of these big local politicians after what is generally considered to be public policy failure. So in Scotland, for example, people generally would say that it has not been a well-run country. It's not really been what switched people out of the SNP. In London, I wouldn't say the mayor is considered to have done a great job, but it's not obvious again that really forces people out because they don't really lay the blame at their door. I think we still instinctively think nationally, although if we had a different candidate on the Conservative side for the mayoralty, it would be somewhat more plausible.
Rachel, you touched on something earlier that is very important. It's turnout and how low turnout hurts Labour far more than the Conservatives, and knitting that together with the issue that you started with, Tom, on voter ID. And I think was that you said 14,000 was the estimate for people that didn't
14,000
were turned away
in May.
Now, that is an incredibly
100,000 for the general election.
That is an incredibly conservative estimate because it is based on the number of recorded people who were turned away for having the incorrect ID. What do I mean by incorrect ID? An older person's Oyster card is accepted. A young person's Oyster card is not. I leave you to draw your conclusions over to which political parties may or may not benefit from that. But I would say that 100,000 could potentially be a gross underestimation of how many people may not, because if you leave the queue, you're not even counted in that 14,000.
And if
got fed up, thinking,
And if you know that you need photographic voter ID and haven't got it, then you also don't bother to turn up in the first place. So it is an underestimate in all probability.
So I think that could also.
And if we're looking at the November vote, when it's dark,
hard to turn out anyway, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Hi, Thomas Mason. I work for the BBC. Question about the tactical voting. You didn't mention proportional representation as being an issue in your opening remarks, but actually, the received wisdom is if Reform stands candidates everywhere, that's going to damage the Tories and benefit Labour. Equally, won't a lot of those, we probably won't be a nation of tactical Tinas collectively if Starmer's doing well. Won't actually a lot of those votes for the Lib Dems damage Labour in the same way as Reform does? And how informed is the public going to be?
Well, I think what seems to have happened in recent elections is that it's now pretty clear that the Lib Dems are in contention with the Conservatives. I think in the 80 seats where they have a prospect, I think it's only one in which they're fighting Labour. So actually, I think in terms of although there is clearly no agreement, in practice, particularly a party that has limited resources is going to focus its resources on the areas it thinks it can win and not the areas where it doesn't think it can win. So actually, there's very little overlap between Labour and the Lib Dems. So yes, there will be seats where perhaps Lib Dems will take theoretically, tactically, all of those votes should vote for Labour if they want to unseat the Conservatives. But as I said, because there isn't that much overlap, it's not. I don't think it's a big problem in terms of for Labour.
It's presumably more plausible that there are seats where the Lib Dems were second last time, and actually Labour might be second. This time. And one of the big demographic shifts we haven't really talked about is what's happened to the university educated, sort of younger and sort of younger middle-aged people of this country. And actually, Labour and Lib Dems are really potentially fighting for those people in a way that wouldn't have been true 20 years ago.
Well, that is true. But I think also Labour have already made that calculation. So when I referred earlier to the 211 non-battlefield constituencies where Labour are appointing candidates, they have already, in effect, listed all the seats where they're not going to be fighting hard. And many of those will be the Lib Dem seats where the Lib Dems are up against the Conservatives. So I think the impact on Labour of Lib Dem voters is pretty minimal, I would suggest.
Right, I think if we could take 2 questions at a go now, just so I don't want people to miss out. So there's...
Oh, thank you. John Tidy, a Tories member. First of all, you're also young. You've forgotten about the 1987 by-election immediately before the general election. Rosie Barnes? No?
Yes, I have. I'm not.
Yeah,
young,
okay.
no.
I'll leave you
I
with
do
that
remember
thought.
it, yeah.
But Tom, I think Tom, is it you?
And her rabbit. You remember Rosie Barnes' rabbit? Yeah, I do remember that.
No, I'm a Greenwich resident, so I lived through it all. I'm a seasoned Labour Party campaigner of many years. But you said about the effect of feet on the ground activists being visible or doing things, and I think that's an issue for all of the parties. Particularly, I think in Labour, there's a lot of disaffected members who are not enthused by the actions particularly recently of Starmer, and that dilutes the ability of any party, but particularly Labour, in marginal constituencies to win an outcome.
How important are physical activists in this sort of day of social media?
You've still got to have people on the ends of phones.
Yeah, so I was going to ask Rachel about this. Certainly from my experience, it feels like boots on the actual ground matter far more to Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens and others, and that Conservative campaigning tends to be more direct mail and phone banking and less of the door knocking. I mean, they do it, but where there's been maybe a surprise victory for the Conservatives to those people locally, it's been like, we didn't see them. They were never, but they came in under the radar, and actually they were doing clever, targeted direct mail and expensive phone banking operation and win. So I think there is right. So that's my other point, which I think is quite interesting. Everything has changed since the last election. As one of the biggest spenders on Facebook at the last election that wasn't a political party, it's completely changed this time around. We are not using the internet or social media in the way that we were. So hardly anyone's on Facebook anymore. Those that are fall much more firmly in the demographic of a Conservative voter. So when we've seen various media reports of how much Sunak and the Conservatives are spending at the moment on Facebook, good for them. That will work. There is no point in me, Labour, others spending too much money there because our voters aren't there anymore. Where they are on other platforms, you don't give them the kind of information you gave Facebook. You would tell Facebook what you liked, whether you read The Guardian, whether you liked The Telegraph, how many children you had, who you were related to, which TV programs you liked. On Instagram, on TikTok, on other platforms, you don't give them any of that information. So it is incredibly hard to do targeted advertising spend, even on platforms where you are allowed to do political advertising, which on platforms like TikTok, you simply can't. I think X.com is now allowing some political ads again, having banned it for quite a while. So it's not obvious how messages are going to be reached. We may end up seeing a much more old school campaign where it's all billboards and wraparounds on local newspapers and that kind of out of home ad spend of 1987 perhaps, rather than 2017, 2019.
I was told before recess that the Tory MPs have all been allotted a certain number of leaflets that are kind of mocked up to look like a newspaper. I think it was 10,000 each, and because and there's a picture of Rishi Sunak on the front of it, and take-up has been so low because people don't think that he is a good sell in their constituency, that they have upped how much each individual MP is allowed to have to 40,000, so they can get rid of them. Right, sorry, I think there was one last question.
Yeah, so I'll put my cards on the table. I work with Tom, so possibly don't ask Tom to respond to this. But we've heard from both Rachel and Naomi about the level of voter disaffection. Keir Starmer kicked off the new year talking about sort of politics that treads more lightly on people's lives. Boris Johnson similarly presented himself as, the agent that would end the chaos, and Sunak likewise. But to what extent is the chaos endemic in Westminster at this moment? And is the voting system contributing to that?
I find it hard to look at politics across Europe and say that the voting system is what is driving a sense of chaos in the UK. We're in a period of, or America, we're in a period of very high political volatility. And it is, John and I talk about this a lot, it's inevitable that you ascribe more cause to what's happening in your own country than perhaps is justified, because a lot of this is about big demographic changes and events, post-financial crisis, climate, etc. I think there is a completely other event we don't have time to get into on, is the chaos in Westminster endemic? Do we not have the structures that allow people to feel that they're governed well and can ignore politics for a long time? I think very possibly, but we probably don't have time to get into it. I think what is important to remember always, and you will all know this, is most people don't care about politics very much, and they don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to listen to it. The reason that the 2019 slogan was "Get Brexit Done" rather than "Succeed at Brexit" was because people just didn't want to talk about it anymore. And Leave voters really didn't want to talk about it because they were more likely people who didn't care about politics very much.
Yeah.
And I think you have to remember that. I thought it was actually an intelligent sort of rhetorical device from Starmer to because normally it's not the left that talks about treading more lightly on people's lives. But I thought
I like that.
He had a point.
I think it's a difficult sell, though. I think it is the right approach, because I agree with you. I think everyone is fed up with the drama and wants politics to go away and shut up, to paraphrase our former Defence Secretary. But
I had so many. Which one?
Gavin Williamson. But remember, he said Russia should.
Vaguely.
Putin, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway. But it's a difficult thing to get a headline with, that message, because it's not an exciting headline.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say possibly something slightly different. I think the chaos, a lot of the chaos we have seen in government recently is sort of homegrown. I mean, it's that the five families, as they're now apparently called within the Conservative Party, these different groupings, the Common Sense grouping, the One Nation, are possibly because they've been in power for so long, now no longer feel the need to present a united front. So they're scrabbling around. They're each pushing their agenda, or something that Hannah White from the Institute for Government was saying earlier today, and that chaos, if there is a change of government with Labour as a majority government, I suspect that certainly that chaos will not continue. There'll be a period of honeymoon with the country, a period of honeymoon within the party, whether then some months or years down the line, that same sort of fractionalism emerges within the Labour Party, perhaps as sections within the Labour Party get unhappy, as they did in 1997, when the incoming Labour government had committed to the first 2 years of spending plans of the previous Conservative government. As they get unhappy, once they reflect on how the factionalism in the Conservative Party really pulled the government one way or another, whether they then start to whether they're going to be five Labour families 2 years down the line after the next general election, where that chaos, internal chaos, political chaos within Parliament continues. I think the jury's out, and we'll have to wait and see.
Certainly a slim majority is less stressful than a large one, which allows factions within the parliamentary party of whichever shade it is to sort of cause trouble with abandon, knowing that votes will always get through and government will be able to.
And also, I think a lot of it will come down to the selection process, because, obviously a lot of 2019 Conservative MPs, or not a lot, but certainly some, were not necessarily
expected to win.
Whereas I think Labour's selection process has been very rigorous and quite centralised, and with a view to sort of having fewer rebels in the ranks. But I just want one last question, and just a sort of one sentence answer, if that's possible, because there's been a lot of talk even this evening about, is it a 97 style election? Is it a 92 style election? 2015. So if you can give me a date and one sentence, no more, to explain why you think what you think. Is there a year that you can compare it to, and if so, why? Rachel, do you want to go first? Put you on the spot.
It's closer to 97 than any other recent ones. But in 97, Blair's approvals were very high and people felt hope. Neither are true now.
Okay, nice.
I feel that it's like 1997 because we have had, as we had from 92 to 97, a series of mishaps, changes of prime ministers, resignations over sexual allegations and so on, people resigning over policy issues, most recently with Mr. Skidmore. So it feels like 97 to me.
Well, I don't want to be so boring as to say 97. What I'll say is not similar about 97 is that geopolitically very, very different. You know, USSR just collapsed and Russia was potentially somebody we could talk to. Very, very different situation now. The economy was growing. That is not the economy that Labour are going to inherit. And the thought of Blair having the left hates him in 96, 97, the way it feels like the left, particularly over the issue of Palestine. They really, really don't like Starmer at the moment. So Starmer is not Blair. Whether the election outcome will be more 97 than not, I don't know. Maybe it'll end up more like 2005, where they'll get a decent majority, but maybe only on 35% of the vote.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Naomi. And thank you all for coming.